here, Bartel Road is here. We're basically looking at a tax map. We looked at, starting this project, the downtown core, which was defined by a couple blocks just south of Guyung Road, or a couple parcels, excuse me, south of Guyung Road, up to Bennett Street. And then as we further got into this project, we realized that we needed to also look at the transition area to the downtown core, which is a stretch of Route 11, down to the end of our study area for Hamlet in our plan, which is Miller Road and Orangeburg Road. And what we came up basically is with two districts. The downtown core, we're calling it, which I just mentioned, which relates to that illustration I just talked about in our plan, specifically. Again, these are parcels fronting Route 11. And then we came up with a name of the Hamlet Gateway District, which is the area immediately south of that downtown core district that I just talked about. Again, it's parcels fronting Route 11. And we tried to illustrate this for the code. Here's the existing view to the north, downtown core is down here. This is, in general, the Hamlet Gateway area. We tried to illustrate some of the principles that we wanted to capture in our code. After we looked at what we wanted to do and accomplish, we looked at alternatives for types of zoning. And through a recommendation from us and our experiences working with Onondaga County and other places, such as Saratoga Springs and some other villages and towns in central New York, we recommended that the town look at a form-based code, which is the name of our code that we have for those two districts I just identified. And basically, a form-based code looks at zoning a lot different than conventional zoning codes do. Typically, conventional zoning codes look at the three things up here: use, impact, and form, with an emphasis on use. In fact, the existing zoning in our form-based code now is general commercial, so it just talks about the uses that are allowed and less about impacts and form, which I'll explain here in a second. Form-based code has a heavier impact or emphasis, excuse me, on form and less on use. Use is still an important part of it, but the emphasis is more on the form of the environment on that street. So when I talk about form and what this code is trying to talk about as well, is that there's form-based things in our public realm. That's our streetscape out to basically the frontage or facades of our private buildings. Those things are building heights. They define your corridor space and they scale to a pedestrian scale. They can. Build-to lines, which is a term to define setbacks. Facades and how they relate to the street. It's preferred in this corridor and most corridors that the facades are parallel to the street. Architectural treatments. It's preferred that there's a sense of commonality. We're not trying to dictate the exact architectural treatments, but there's some materials and practices that are common sense and should use to basically reflect the history and the character of the Hamlet of Brewerton. And two other things: parking. It's preferred that parking is screened and doesn't front the street. It should be either to the side of the building or to the rear, preferably. If it's in the front, it should at least be screened. And mixed uses. I mentioned that uses isn't emphasized in this type of code, but it's important to understand that what we try to do is allow a mix of uses. And when I say mix of uses, that means the gamut from commercial all the way to residential, and combining those, which makes more a lively and active destination. What I want to do, and again, I'm not going to go through all the details for the zoning code. It would take a long time to do that. And again, I hope the summary that I've handed out gives you a comparison of the existing zoning and the proposed zoning and why we made some of the changes. But I just thought it'd be worthwhile to go through some of the organizing principles and headings in the zoning. Again, just more clear on what the intent is of the code. One of the organizing principles in the form-based code is how buildings front the public frontage, which again is your streets and your sidewalks. And we've identified a preferred type of frontage. In some areas it's porches, some areas it's stoops, in some areas it's shop fronts like this that should happen. And the shop front really should work best in the downtown core. of the Hamlet. And then just like a typical zoning code, we talk about dimensional regulations. And we tried to outline these in a user-friendly format by identifying and illustrating a preferred building scenario. But we also talk about typically lot dimensions, setbacks, building height, frontage types, which I just mentioned, and then parking placement and access. And it's all in a table, one table or one sheet per district. We believe we've organized the uses in a user-friendly format. Again, it's one table, one sheet, and we actually provide backup descriptions of what the uses are, something that the current code in the town of Cicero does not do. We've gotten a lot more specific, and that's not only for uses, but for other components of the code as well. Talk about architecture standards and guidelines, and it's important to point out that we have standards, which are law, and there's some architecture standards that we talk about, some materials, roof forms, and then there's guidelines, which are really recommendations, because again, the purpose of this form-based code is to help guide development and make it more predictable. And so we've combined standards and guidelines, and I'd have to say that the majority of the code as it exists is probably 80% guidelines and 20% standards, at least on the architectural component. We talk about landscape standards, something that's not in detail in the current town of Cicero zoning code. And that's landscape standards specifically more for how to deal with parking lots. You know, providing islands, buffering neighbors that are adjacent to parking lots. And we, again, tried to illustrate that in a drawing that's included in the zoning code. I just brought this image because this is just suggesting one way that screening parking can happen. How parking, excuse me, can be screened when it's adjacent to a sidewalk and adjacent to a street, which is actually here. Just a simple treatment, but makes the pedestrian environment more friendly. That's the goal of this project. Another component that's important is signage standards. Again, we were much more specific on signage in those two districts, the Hamlet Gateway District and the downtown core. And hopefully we're more we were able to illustrate, hopefully in words, more clearly what the desire is for signage in that district. Again, we're not trying to take away from businesses, but we're trying to reduce the clutter along Brewerton and preventing future clutter on the street. And then finally, part of our zoning code is new definitions. There's some terminology that's new to the town of Cicero, and it's been looked at by the county. They've been using some of the terminology in other communities. So we've actually added definitions, and then at the end we have a table, which hopefully is helpful to both districts, in fact, on what types of permits, what trips a permit, whether you're a residence or a commercial entity or some other identity, and how to handle that through this code. Again, code is about being user-friendly, helping the community understand what they're going to get, make it more predictable, and again, hopefully help revitalize the Hamlet of Brewerton. And I think it's a huge, big step for the town of Cicero to take this initiative.